Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Good morning, everyone. Well, Clay is working out of town this weekend, so you're stuck with me again. Sorry about that. But we have a good story for you this week, and hopefully I can do it justice. So grab a cup of coffee and enjoy the story. This is Book 5 of the Wolfman Chronicles, Part 52. We've been doing this for 52 weeks, if you can believe that. This is Chapter 1, Welcome Home. And it takes place in Alaska. And you can probably hear my dog snoring in the background. The forest around the cabin was silent, except for the gentle wind that whispered through the branches of the tall trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and the occasional call of an owl. Inside, an oil lamp burned and illuminated the windows with a golden glow. They could see the old man sitting alone at the table, his gaze pointing downwards, most likely reading. The dogs were not outside, as far as they could tell. The old mule stood silently in her pen, the door to her shed ajar, should she want to go inside. The drone made a soft purring noise as it flew over the mule's pen, and she looked up and gave a slight whinny, but it was not a cry of alarm. And the old man didn't shift his position. The drone, after circling the meadow around the cabin, flew straight up above the treetops and was now gliding in ever-increasing circles. Fitted with a night scope, Igor was able to search the land surrounding the cabin, looking for structures. They knew Sasha and her partner were staying somewhere on this old man's property, but they didn't know exactly where. But the house had not been difficult to find. Situated on a bluff overlooking the river, the house was the only one near the old man's cabin. It had to be the one. Igor was surprised at the size of the building. They'd been expecting another cabin, small and rustic, similar to Old Man Grizzly's. This was a mansion in comparison, a large log home built into the hillside with at least 2 levels and large decks that overlooked the surrounding wilderness and the river beyond. Quietly, they made their way through the trees until they found the dirt road that led up to the house. The meadow that was the front yard was illuminated by the light of the moon and the night sky that was not fully dark in the month of August. Though days were getting shorter now, the night sky still held the faint remnants of the perpetual midnight sun that Alaska is known for. Natia and Igor both were well adept at breaking into buildings. Many of their past assignments had required it, and this one was as easy as pie. There was no security system in place, just a quick pick of the lock and they were in. Natia moved through the dimly lit house with the grace of a panther, her dark eyes scanning the foreign surroundings. Her hand brushed against the wooden banister of the staircase, and for a moment a flicker of something, nostalgia maybe, flared in her chest. This is where my mother lives, she thought to herself. Igor's voice cut through her thoughts, low and cautious. Natia, you need to focus. We have a job to do. She glanced at him, her partner in every sense of the word, and nodded. They had trained together since childhood and shared secrets that bound them closer than blood. Yet, as she looked at him now, standing in the shadows with that familiar stoic expression, she felt a distance between them, a gulf that had widened ever since they had arrived in Alaska. She had overheard part of Igor's conversation with Vitya just shortly after they'd arrived, and now a shadow of doubt had crept into her mind. Was he really here for her because she needed him and had asked him to come? Or was he merely acting the part because this was his assignment? Could she trust him to understand her feelings? Focus. This was all supposed to be about the stolen jewel, the one the organization was desperate to retrieve, Russia's crown jewel. Sasha, her mother, had it, and now, after all these years, Natia was here, not just to retrieve the jewel, but to confront the woman who had brought her into this world and then, as far as Natia had been told, abandoned her. The organization had shown her the files, the photos of her mother's life after she had left Natia behind. She had seen Sasha smiling, traveling, living a life without her daughter. Natia had been conditioned to hate her, to view her as nothing more than a target. But standing in this house, surrounded by the remnants of a mother she had only barely known, the cracks in that conditioning were beginning to show. Igor was moving through the house methodically, checking the rooms, ensuring there were no surprises. "They'll be back in a couple of days," he said, returning to the living room. "We should prepare." Natia nodded again, but her mind was elsewhere. She walked to the fireplace where a couple of framed photos stood. Her eyes fell on one in particular, a photograph of Sasha as a young woman, holding a baby in her arms. The baby's dark eyes and serious expression mirrored Natia's own. It was like looking into a past she had never been allowed to claim. "She didn't abandon me," Natia whispered, more to herself than to Igor. "They took me from her." Igor paused, his expression hardening. "That's irrelevant now. What matters is the mission." Natia clenched her jaw. She had been raised by the organization, molded into the perfect weapon, but no amount of training could erase the truth she had buried deep inside, the truth that she had always known, even if she had been forced to deny it. Sasha was her mother, and despite everything, despite the years of separation and the lies she had been fed, there was a bond between them that could not be severed. "We can take the jewel and leave without harming them," Natia said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. "They don't have to die. I'm sure she wouldn't be traveling with it. It must be here somewhere. We have a couple of days to find it. Then we can leave before they get here." Igor's eyes narrowed. "Natia, you know what the organization expects. What if we don't find it? If they resist—" "I'm not killing my mother," she snapped, the words bursting out before she could stop them. The room fell into an oppressive silence, the weight of her defiance hanging in the air between them. Igor's gaze softened just a fraction. "Natia, we don't have a choice. If we fail, the organization will come for us. You know that." She did know. The organization was ruthless, and failure was not an option. But as she stood in that house, surrounded by the ghosts of a life she had been denied, Natia realized she could no longer be the weapon they had forged her into. "Maybe it's time we stop running from them," she said quietly, her resolve hardening. "Maybe it's time we fight back." Igor looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing, and Natia wondered if she had just made a fatal mistake. But then, slowly, he nodded. "If we do this," he said, his voice low and serious, "we do it together." Natia felt a rush of relief, mixed with a surge of determination. They would face whatever came next, but they would do it on their own terms. No more running, no more hiding. They would protect Sasha and Jack, retrieve the jewel, and find a way to return it and free themselves from the organization's grasp at the same time. "Look," Igor said, "we've got a few days to think about this. Let's try to find the jewel, and then we can decide what to do next." Natia threw her arms around Igor's neck and kissed him. Back in Mexico, now that the wedding was in the past, along with all the drama that went with it, Everyone could relax and watch the little ones as they explored their surroundings. A couple more days in the hot August sun, and they'd all be flying to Alaska. Everyone was excited to see the new place Jack and Sasha had acquired and meet the infamous Grizzly Adams. Miguel walked into the kitchen where Rosa was busy frying fresh-made tortillas. He reached over and gave her a kiss on the cheek while stealing a hot tortilla off the plate on the counter. She quickly shooed him away. "Come with us, Rosa," Miguel said as he savored the hot, buttery tortilla. "Who will watch over the place while you're gone?" she asked. "I've got hired men for that. You could use a vacation," he replied. "Miguel, you know I've never been outside of Mexico. I don't have a passport. I don't even have a driver's license." "Nonsense," Miguel replied. "Those things are easy to get. We can have your passport ready in 2 days. I'm not going to take no for an answer." "But Miguel, I've never been on an airplane. I would be terrified." He put his arm around her. "Rosa, you've been taking care of me my whole life. It's time I got to do something nice for you. And Catherine could use your help with the babies." At the mention of the babies, Rosa smiled. Miguel knew exactly what would make Rosa change her mind about coming. She had taken care of Miguel and Juanita when they were that age, and it would be her biggest blessing to be needed again. Tears filled her eyes as she accepted. Miguel walked out onto the veranda with a big smile on his face. "She's coming," he said. "Well, that wasn't hard," Juanita replied. "I told her she had to take care of Ulfer and Una. She couldn't resist," he smiled. Julian seemed preoccupied. Juanita kicked his leg under the table, and he looked up from his phone. "What? Did I miss something?" Juanita rolled her eyes. "Rosa is coming with us to Alaska." "Oh, good," he replied, but looked back at his phone. "What are you doing?" Juanita asked, showing her irritation. Julian put down his phone. "Sorry, I was just checking on Montoya. I managed to get one of his nurses to text me his diagnosis. Apparently, the bullet didn't do any major damage, but he had a pulmonary embolism and suffered a heart attack on the way to the hospital. The bullet wound may have aggravated it, but he was a walking time bomb to begin with. He just underwent major heart surgery, and now he's slipped into a coma. They don't think he's going to make it." "Wow," Juanita replied sarcastically. "Couldn't have happened to a nicer person. I feel bad for his 2 girls, though." Julian didn't know how to take the news. He knew Montoya was behind the shooting incident and probably used Julian's own money to pay for it. "If he lives through this, I still have to kill him," he thought to himself. "But it won't be for a while." Grizzly stood on the edge of his porch, the early morning chill biting at his weathered skin as he relieved himself, a plume of steam rising into the crisp Alaskan air. It was a morning habit, one that gave him the opportunity to survey his surroundings and feel a flicker of gratitude for another day of living in the wilderness he called home. The landscape was quiet, the vast expanse of forest stretching out before him, untouched and unyielding. As he finished and tucked himself back into his worn trousers, Grizzly scratched his scruffy beard, his keen eyes narrowing as he noticed something out of place. Molly stepped out of her stall and nodded to him, the signal that it was time to give her some grub. He ignored her and walked back inside for his binoculars. Through the lens, he could definitely see it now. It was faint, barely more than a whisper against the horizon, but it was there, rising from the direction of Sasha and Jack's place. He frowned. They weren't supposed to be back for another day or 2, and nobody else should be up there. He stood watching it for a moment, studying the way the smoke moved. It was not a forest fire, of that he was certain. Didn't look much like a campfire, neither. this was smoke from the fireplace, he was almost certain. Grizzly spat into the dirt and turned back to his cabin. His shotgun leaned against the wall next to the door, and he grabbed it without a second thought. Slinging it over his shoulder, he pulled on his thick fur-lined coat, the weight of it familiar and comforting. He still needed his cane to walk, so with the dogs in tow and Molly to hold on to, he trudged up the old dirt road that led to the house on the ridge. His mind wandered to Sasha and Jack. They were good folks, the kind that didn't cause trouble and kept to themselves, just the way he liked it. He had a soft spot for them, though he'd never admit it out loud, especially not to Sasha, who had a way of seeing through his gruff exterior that made him feel exposed. But now, with them gone and strangers lurking around their place, that soft spot turned into a knot of worry in his gut. He didn't like the idea of someone skulking around up there, not in his woods. When he finally reached the ridge, he crouched low, hidden in the trees as silently as a shadow. The house was in view now, and he kept the dogs back and tied Molly to a tree. Smoke curled from the chimney, though he didn't see any movement inside the house. He eased forward, his senses on high alert. The dogs stayed back as he commanded, but their ears were perked forward, listening as intently as he was. As he crept closer, he caught a glimpse of movement through the window, a tall figure pacing back and forth, and then another, smaller figure, sitting on the couch. Grizzly's grip tightened on his shotgun. It wasn't Sasha and Jack. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. These were strangers, intruders, and they had made themselves at home in the middle of his territory, in his damn home. He was about to make his presence known, maybe fire off a warning shot and see how fast they'd scatter, when something made him pause. There was something about the way the smaller figure moved that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. It was strangely familiar, yet distant, like a memory just out of reach. Somehow he knew it was a girl, her shape and her size, though he was still far enough from the house to see her clearly. He decided to wait, to watch a little longer. There was something more to this than met the eye, and if Grizzly Adams had learned anything in his long, solitary life, it was that things weren't always what they seemed. So he settled in behind a thick pine, his breath steady, his gaze locked on the windows of the big house. He'd wait, and when the time was right, he'd make his move, but not a moment sooner. Jack eased the truck down the narrow dirt road, the headlights cutting through the thickening dusk. Sasha sat beside him, her thoughts a million miles away. The trip to Mexico had been a necessary escape, a chance to breathe after the chaos of the past few months. Yet, with all the drama of the wedding, it had not been the restful vacation they had hoped for. But now, as they approached Grizzly's cabin, a new sense of unease crept over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "We're almost home," Jack smiled, trying to lighten the mood, but even he could sense the tension in the air. Sasha nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm happy to be home. I know we've only had this place a couple of weeks, but it feels like home, and I've missed it," she said, though her mind was still far away. She couldn't pinpoint it, but something felt off. She brushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to the exhaustion of travel. "I just feel anxious, I guess. Maybe it's just the travel." They pulled up beside the cabin, the familiar sight of the rustic home bringing a brief moment of relief. But as Jack turned off the engine, that uneasy feeling returned, stronger this time. The cabin was too quiet, too still. "Jack," Sasha said, her voice tinged with anxiety, "where are the dogs?" Jack frowned, glancing around. Yeah, something's not right. Wait here. Jack had planned on picking up the dogs and inviting Grizzly up to the house to meet everyone the following morning, since it was already late and everyone was tired from the long day of travel. Following behind Jack's truck, Miguel pulled up in a rented SUV with Rosa, Juanita, and Julian inside. Behind him was Usko and Catherine with the two babies, sound asleep in their car seats. Usko pulled his rented sedan in behind Miguel. Jack walked to the vehicles and told everyone to stay put. Jack cautiously walked up to Grizzly's door and knocked. There was no answer. He tried the door handle, but it was locked. He stepped to the window and peered inside. The oil lamp was in the middle of the table, but not lit. Books and papers were scattered on the table, but there was no sign of Grizzly or the dogs. Molly was standing in her stall looking very annoyed. Jack turned to Sasha. He's not here, and neither are the dogs. I don't think he'd go into town without Molly. Maybe he took the dogs down to the river. Let's go on up to the house, and then we'll head back here and see if he's back. They drove up the long dirt road to the big house. The first thing they noticed were the lights on inside the house. The two dogs came running to greet them. How strange, Sasha said, but he knew we were coming back tonight, so he must have come up here to turn the lights on for us. Well, at least we know where he is now, Jack replied. As everyone was walking up the steps to the side door of the house that led into the kitchen, Jack hollered, "Grizz, are you here?" The dogs bounded inside in front of them, and as they walked in, they were surprised to see 3 people sitting at the kitchen table, drinking whiskey and playing a hand of cards. The young girl sitting at the table stood and caught Sasha's eye as she walked in the door. Her heart pounded as she faced her mother for the first time in over a decade. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. Sasha's eyes widened in shock, her breath catching in her throat. "Natia," Sasha whispered, disbelief and recognition warring in her expression. Sasha's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had thought her daughter was lost to her forever, but now here she was, standing in their living room, alive and more beautiful than she could ever have imagined. They both stood staring at each other for what seemed like an eternity. Then Sasha rushed forward and threw her arms around her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "How?" She couldn't get the words to form. "There's no time to explain," Natia said quickly, glancing at Igor. "We came for the jewel." Sasha's hand went to her throat, as if the necklace would be there. "You're with them, aren't you? The organization?" Nadia's expression softened. "I was," she admitted, "but not anymore. I won't let them hurt you, Mom." The word Mom hit Sasha like a physical blow, bringing more tears to her eyes. Natia looked at her, the hardened exterior she had built over the years, crumbling in that moment. "I never stopped thinking about you," she admitted softly, "even when they tried to make me forget." Sasha held Natia's face in her 2 hands. "I never stopped searching for you. You know that, don't you? I never stopped." Igor walked over and put his hand on Natia's shoulder. "Hi, Sasha. I'm glad to finally meet you. I'm Igor. We need to make a plan, and we need to do it tonight. The organization knows we are here. They know what flight you were on, and they will know that we've made contact with you. We are constantly being tracked." He looked down at the scar on his wrist. "Natia and I both. They inserted the tracking mechanisms when we were first taken. We were both very young then." Jack took Igor's wrist and ran his thumb along the scar. "Is there any way to remove it?" "We know others who have tried. They didn't live long enough to tell us if it worked," he replied. Miguel was trying to assess the situation. I'm assuming they'll be sending others over if you don't report back immediately, he said. Yes, Igor replied, if they haven't already. Grizzly stood up and yawned. Well, I'll be damned if this isn't the strangest welcome home I've ever seen. He looked at Catherine and Usko holding the two sleeping youngsters in their arms. Come on, you two. I'll show you to your rooms. Kat and Usko put the little ones to bed and came back to the dining room to join the others who were discussing plans to keep everyone safe should agents from the organization show up at the doorstep. Jack cleared his throat. Now that we have you all here, I guess I better fill you in on what's really happening here. You think? Catherine chided him. It sounds like it would have been safer to stay in Mexico. We have the children to think of, Jack. I know. I'm sorry you're all involved in this mess. So let me just briefly fill you in. I'll give you the short, abridged version, Jack replied. Sasha's ex-husband stole a famous jewel. He was working for the organization, which is a covert operation initially under the auspices of the Russian government, though it's mostly run by Russian mafia. Instead of handing the jewel over to them, he thought he'd keep it and bargain it back to the actual owners of the jewel, blackmailing the organization. He told Sasha he was doing it to get their daughter back. He hid the jewel in Sasha's apartment, probably to keep himself safe and frame her if he needed to. When he died, Sasha found the jewel, but that's when I was in Russia and she didn't know what to do with the jewel. She knew the Russian mafia was after her, so she fled to the United States and hid at my ranch. She still has the jewel. Apparently, the organization figured Natia here could convince her mother to give her the jewel, and then Natia would turn it over to them. So now we need to figure out a way to keep Sasha and Natia safe. Isn't that correct, Igor? He asked. Igor nodded. Grizzly was leaning back in his chair, hands folded across his chest, listening to the story. Finally, he spoke. Listen here, you all. I've had a couple of days to get to know this young lady and her friend here, and I think they're sincere about wanting to leave this here organization who thinks they own them. I think we dangle that jewel in front of their noses and let them come get it. We'll be waiting. I got enough booby traps to kill every damn one of them. He looked at Jack and winked. And I think you got a trick or two up your sleeve as well. Jack looked down and smiled. Grizz, that's mighty good of you, but I believe this organization is much bigger than any of us can imagine. They'll just keep sending more assassins over, quicker than we can keep up with eliminating them. No, I think we need to give them the jewel. That's what they really want. And in trade, they let Natia and Igor go. In theory, that sounds good, but I don't think they'll ever really let us go, Igor replied. It's worth a try, Natia said. I'd rather die than go back to Russia. Well, thank you all for listening to this week's episode of the Wolfman Chronicles, and I hope you'll join us next week for the next part of the story. Have a great week, everyone.